some troubling signs coming out of Trump's presidential immunity case in front of the Supreme Court. It was also kind of scary that they even decided to take up the case, because legal experts who are acting in good faith basically universally say, this is crap. No, the president does not have immunity to violate the law.
Or, I was just saying, I didn't make this point, but maybe you could run for president on, I'm going to assassinate the Supreme Court because I get to do what I want.
Right. Well, then they might change their tune on presidential immunity. But he would have no reason to do that right now, because they are really helping Trump out here. So the fact that they took up this case in and of itself meant that oral arguments would have to happen in late April. They happened yesterday. And the Jack Smith's prosecution wouldn't be able to start, delaying it and guaranteeing that this prosecution would not happen before the election, basically. There was still some optimism that maybe they could squeeze it in, but the Supreme Court ended that basically yesterday, because they are making the case, and it looks like they're going to go in this direction, that the concept of presidential immunity needs to be sent back down to the lower courts so they can analyze the election plot and make determinations on whether or not it constitutes official presidential duties or not. And that's essentially what they're arguing here. What acts by the president constitute official acts by the president, and which ones count as personal ones, which seems like a ridiculous distinction, but you have to understand what the Supreme Court's true motives here are. It's to delay this case, delay the prosecution until after the election, so Trump has a shot. There was, as I said, some feelings that, well, maybe, they support the broader Republican project and the conservative deregulation of industry and capitalism broadly, and maybe they won't take this case to help Trump out because there are some in the Republican donor class and such that want basically Trump to be out of the party's power structure as soon as possible, and perhaps a second Biden term might be easier for that. But that's not how apparently they appear to be acting, at least in what they're saying in oral arguments. Neil Gorsuch made it clear, and I think Kavanaugh as well, that they're choosing to decide on this in a way that it would apply to future presidents, not just Donald Trump. And they are also seemingly going to make a determination on different kinds of actions and what that means as it relates to presidential immunity. One of the arguments was made here by Sam Alito. He is questioning here special counsel Jack Smith's attorney, Michael Dreeben, in oral arguments about presidential immunity.
I'm sure you would agree with me that a stable democratic society requires that a candidate who loses an election, even a close one, even a hotly contested one, leave office peacefully if that candidate is the incumbent.
Of course.
All right. Now, if an incumbent who loses a very close, hotly contested election knows that a real possibility after leaving office is not that the president is going to be able to go off into a peaceful retirement, but that the president may be criminally prosecuted by a bitter political opponent, will that not lead us into a cycle that destabilizes the functioning of our country as a democracy? And we can look around the world and find countries where we have seen this process, where the loser gets thrown in jail.
So I think it's exactly the opposite, Justice Alito. There are lawful mechanisms to contest the results in an election, and outside the record, but I think of public knowledge, petitioner and his allies filed dozens of electoral challenges, and my understanding is lost all but one that was not outcome determinative in any respect. There were judges that said in order to sustain substantial claims of fraud that would overturn an election result that's certified by a state, you need evidence, you need proof. And none of those things were manifested. So there is an appropriate way to challenge things through the courts with evidence. If you lose, you accept the results. That has been the nation's experience. I think the court is well familiar with that.
Thank you. Justice.
So the argument there, I just want to be clear to people, is that the idea is that presidents who are fearful of criminal prosecution after they leave office would destabilize the country further because of the looming prosecution that would come later. Isn't it exactly the opposite? Shouldn't we want our presidents to behave in a lawful manner and have the threat of being held accountable for breaking the law after leaving office be something that they take into consideration, versus this idea that a president who's worried about who is not worried about future prosecutions basically acting in a way that would be destabilizing? It makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah,
it's
if
the
you
reverse.
if you don't want to be charged with a crime you commit as the executive of the most powerful leader in the entire world, then don't run to be the most powerful leader in the entire world.
I mean, we're actually seeing this, though, with Donald Trump. He's behaving in a more reckless manner because of these prosecutions. But anyway, I'm so twisted up in knots based on that argument that I don't even know what to say to it. Justice Sotomayor had a more sane take here. Here she is asking Trump's attorney, John Sauer, about whether a president can order a rival of his to be assassinated, and would that still constitute presidential immunity?
Malum in se is a concept long viewed as appropriate in law, that there's some things that are so fundamentally evil that they have to be protected against. Now, I think, and your answer below, I'm going to give you a chance to say if you stay by it. If the president decides that his rival is a corrupt person and he orders the military or orders someone to assassinate him, is that within his official acts that for which he can get immunity?
It would depend on the hypothetical, but we can see that could well be an official act.
They could, and why? Because he's doing it for personal reasons. He's not doing it like President Obama is alleged to have done it, to protect the country from a terrorist. He's doing it for personal gain. And isn't that the nature of the allegations here? That he's not doing these acts in furtherance of an official responsibility. He's doing it for personal gain.
I agree with that characterization of the indictment, and that confirms immunity, because the characterization is that there's a series of official acts that were done for an unlawful.
No, because immunity says even if you did it for personal gain, we won't hold you responsible. How could that be?
So she makes a great argument there, and the Republicans really have no answer. And obviously the Supreme Court was behaving in this partisan manner. I got an opportunity to just sit with what Alito was saying there. It's just like the idea that the anxiety that the president would feel because of the threat of looming prosecution would prevent him from being an effective leader says something a little bit about your mentality. You're telling on yourself. You're essentially saying that a president cannot do his job without breaking the law.
Stressing me out.
or that the anxiety of like there being political prosecutions later, which I think he's taking massive leaps in logic to get to, and then the underlying assumption is that he believes that this is a political prosecution of Donald Trump. that would be worse than the structure of a president being unable to be held accountable. That just the feelings of the president being like, I can't do what I want, is somehow more important than our system of government putting checks and balances on the executive branch, is one of the most unconstitutional concepts I have ever heard in my life, and one of the things that's in the least spirit of the good elements of what the founding fathers wanted, which is separation of powers, which is like not having a president to be able to behave as a king, to have a check on his or her, maybe at some time in my lifetime, authority. So it is one of the, he is such a freak, but what he's arguing there is that for a state, he said something about a stable democratic society, that immunity for criminal prosecution is important to maintaining a stable society for a president, is really inverted logic, to put it mildly. So seems like they'll probably send it back to the lower courts so they can make this abstract determination about what constitutes an official act as president, or as something that is related to him personally. But I can't think of anything more personal than Trump having a temper tantrum and trying to overturn the democratic results of an election. How that could be interpreted as an official act on behalf of the American people in the executive branch, you see how silly this argument is.
I'm imagining the Supreme Court in rubble, and then a bunch of lawyers getting together to be like, hey, was that an official act or not that just send that cruise missile into the Supreme Court?
Let's send it back down to the lower courts, and then maybe they can side. Or actually,
Get our reading glasses
they're
on.
the new Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court apparently no longer exists in this scenario. I'm reminded of my talk with Harvard professor Ryan Dorfler yesterday about how now we need to start to talk about defying the Supreme Court, and there's a historic precedent to do so.
Yep.
But I digress.